Hey everybody, I'm Jacob Castro and welcome to another video here on Jacob's Aquarium. So if you're looking for a grassy foreground plant for your planted tank that's, I would say, kind of easy to grow. It does require a few specialty items, but it is easy to grow nonetheless. That's a little bit towards the medium scale for planted tanks. I got a perfect plant for you today in this plant guide, and it's called Microsword. So as with every plant guide, we'll be talking about this plant's color, compatibility, and how to propagate it, and of course its growth habits. So first, let's start with color. Now normally Microsword will appear light to dark green in color, but if it starts to turn yellow, that's a problem because that does mean that it's unhealthy. So you want to take some steps to bring it back to its nice lighter dark green color. Now I say lighter dark green because usually in a medium lit or medium light environment in an aquarium, the plant tends to stay a little bit darker green, and in a low light environment it tends to be more of a light green color, which is typical with most plants, as I say in pretty much all of these videos. If you have a plant in a highlight tank, it gets darker. In a low light tank, it kind of stays a little bit more dull and subtle in color, so I say lighter dark green for that reason, but that's the normal coloration for this plant. But like I said, if it turns yellow, that's a sign that it's unhealthy, and that could be a nutrient deficiency or the plant not getting enough light. And most plants, I would say, do develop this yellow coloration when they do become unhealthy, but in Microsword it's a little bit more prevalent because it is a grassy plant, and when it starts to turn yellow, it's very noticeable. Just watch out for that. But yeah, like I said, normally as far as color, it'll be light to dark green in color depending on what type of lighting you're growing it under. Now, as far as compatibility, this plant I would say is not a plant that you want to keep with larger fish like cichlids or any aggressive fish like that. I would say it's a perfect plant for just normal planted tank fish, small tetras or even small gouramis, small fish that are non-nippy, don't dig in the substrate, fish along those lines. I've noticed with people that house this plant with say cichlids or other large fish, they kind of tend to dig it up a lot, and it just literally just falls apart. And you can't grow this plant on driftwood. It does rely heavily on nutrients in your substrate, so it's just not a plant that you can grow successfully with large fish, because most large fish tend to disturb the substrate a lot, which could damage this plant, as I said. So it's a plant more along the lines for small planted tank fish, as I said, tetras, gouramis, mollies, fish along those lines that are non-nippy, small, don't disturb things, and I think they kind of look a little bit better with this plant as well. When you grow this plant out and it gets really, really grassy, it just takes over the whole foreground portion of your aquarium. When you have a school of really tiny fish, it just contrasts really well. I just think it looks cool. With bigger fish, it kind of takes away from the overall aspect of, hey, this is a foreground plant, it's grassy, it kind of just doesn't fit the scale, in other words. So I think small fish just work much better with this plant for a number of reasons, as I just mentioned, but most importantly because big fish will just damage this plant, which is definitely not what you want. And now we move on to propagation. So to propagate this plant, it is as simple as taking off a little clump from the original one that you bought and replanting it, and that'll grow a whole nother portion of this plant. It's that easy. But one thing you want to make sure that you don't do is you don't propagate this plant as soon as you buy it. And I say that because most Microsword plants that you buy online especially have been grown immersed, which means part of the plant's been grown out of the water, and this plant has kind of a harder time transitioning to a submerged growing environment, I guess you could say. It does tend to melt a lot, and in particularly in the root system, which can go unnoticed because the root system is buried in the substrate, and it could really damage the plant. So while the plant is still transitioning to growing, submerged, don't propagate it yet, because you could just risk further damaging the plant because it's already being damaged by being grown submerged. So don't propagate it as soon as you get it. Maybe wait, I would say 3 or 4 weeks until it's had some time to establish and grow some new roots and new leaves. Just give it some time to establishing your tank, because propagating it too early can just further damage the plant as it's going through its transition from growing immersed to submerged. And lastly, we move on to growth habits. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, this plant is a grassy foreground plant, and how it grows is it produces runners, which are basically just, extensions of this plant that produce roots, and then of course produce a leaf, an individual leaf, and so on and so forth. And once these runners grow densely together with each other, or in other words, once the plant has had some time to establish in your tank, this plant will turn into a really dense, thick carpet looking plant. I would say though that you can't really expect it to look similar to, I would say, dwarf hairgrass or dwarf baby tears, because for one, the leaves on this plant are a little bit thicker, a little bit thicker than the dwarf hairgrass. So while I say grassy plant, it's more of like a more larger scale grassy plant. And it doesn't grow that close to the substrate too. It does grow a little bit higher than even dwarf hairgrass, I would say. So it's a plant more for a medium scale tank, but nonetheless, it is a grassy plant. It will grow into a really thick carpet, but it just depends on the scale that you're trying to achieve with your tank. I would say if you're trying to achieve like a, if you're already using small plants in your aquarium, stick with dwarf hairgrass or dwarf baby tears. But if you have large plants in your tank, like Anubias or Java fern, or even Liguidia, that's kind of a large plant as well once it gets established, microsort will just contrast perfectly with those plants. So as I said, it's more along the lines of a medium scale plant, because it does grow a little bit bigger than most foreground plants that we're all used to. Alright, and before I go, I just wanted to give you guys some tips on how you can grow this plant successfully in your aquarium. So I haven't actually had a lot of time to experience growing microsort. I think I just started selling it on my website about 2 or 3 months ago. But I will say, for the short amount of time that I've had this plant, and I've had it growing in my tank, it is a fast grower, under the right conditions, under medium to high light. It grows pretty fast, along with CO2 and nutrients as well. So I would say if your tank is lacking in those things, if you have a low light tank with minimal nutrients, no CO2, it'll probably grow a lot slower. But I should also say though that I think that this plant is very, it relies heavily on CO2, because even though I dose nutrients, I have good light on my tank, I noticed that the one time where the tank that it was being grown in went without CO2 for, I believe it was 3 or 4 days when I was getting my new CO2 tank exchanged, it really started to decline in health. It was turning yellow. It wasn't growing as fast. So it really had a hard time. So I would say that this plant is best grown with CO2, and I would say if you don't grow it with CO2, try compensating with nutrients, but even still, I think you will run into some problems like slow growth and even some other health problems with this plant. So that's what I've noticed. Of course, everybody's situation out there is different. So do whatever works for you. But that's what I've noticed. I've just noticed that this plant heavily relies on CO2, and being that it's a grassy foreground plant, it grows as a carpeting plant. Make sure your substrate is really high in nutrients. You can't really grow a plant of this magnitude, especially once it gets really big and it's consuming a lot of nutrients. You can't grow this plant in just gravel only, or sand only, or whatever. I know that's what I do, but trust me guys, I compensate a lot with liquid nutrients and CO2. But for a permanent home for this plant, to give it everything that it needs to thrive, give it a good substrate with plenty of nutrients in the substrate. So EcoComplete, ADA soil, Tropica soil, substrates along those lines that are just full of nutrients would be perfect for this plant. So that's pretty much it for this plant guide here on Jacob's Aquarium. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to check out all the links in the description of this video, which take you to my Twitter page, my Facebook page, my Patreon page, my website, everything that I do on the internet, in other words. And also, don't forget to check out my live show that airs every Saturday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time right here on my YouTube channel, which is actually tomorrow. So if you'd like to check it out, just, come to my channel at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time tomorrow, because tomorrow's Saturday. Thanks again for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. Have fun with your tanks, and I will see you next time.